12th, 2020. And today's show is going to be a review and celebration of the Atlantic Nation. I haven't had a chance to talk about that in a little while. And with everything happening, it's very easy to get caught up in the news and always be responding to what's happening in other areas without having a vision of where you want to go. And it's a hard way to live, right? If you're living in a totally reactive mindset. And of course, obviously, God makes his rules, whereas we go along with things, and we only have so many choices as far as that goes. But in as much as we are people and we do have a degree of sovereignty, I think it's important we start asking questions about what we want to do, how we want to develop, and what we want going forward. And so today's show, since it's about, it looks like about quarter after 6, I'm going to go ahead and go into some ideas in a little more depth of things I've been thinking, some conversations we've been having, and how we take an abstract concept, which is Atlantic nationhood, and move toward the realization of an actual goal, which is a nation worth living in. And I'm going to wander a bit, and I will at the end answer some questions. So if you guys want to say hi or whatever, that's fine. But and I may answer some things at the very end, but I'm going to just lay out some ideas of what I'm thinking in sort of a clear set because it's been rolling through my mind. Good morning, Denisha, and good morning to everyone else who's joining me here early on the East Coast. Those of you who live in America know the sun rises first on Maine, and I'm an early riser on a good day. And today's a good day. It's a blessed day. I want to start today by recognizing that yesterday was a reconsecration of sorts. You know, it was the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower Compact, and now we have an opportunity to make a new covenant with the Lord and to consider what a new nation looks like. You know, the Pilgrims made one covenant where they sought to live under king and cross. The Americans made a different covenant where they decided that they were going to go under humanism and that they were going to go in worship of liberty, or Columbia, or there's some different things in there that's kind of shady. And this is an opportunity for us here in the Atlantic to reconsider which way we want to go. In this story, I've certainly made my own prayers and asked for God to bless this land and these people, but not the people who serve in D.C. or the people who run finance in New York or any of those other people. Not because I dislike those people, but because their service is not to the people, to the land, to a culture worth defending. And the thing about prayers are, if you're going to pray to the Lord, you ought to be praying for something that he would want, because the Lord won't lead you astray, which is why a lot of prayers don't get answered. Having faith in his plan and figuring a way to advance that mission has always been part of the battle, which a lot of people don't understand. But throughout all of history, actually, if you understand it right, people have always asked for divine favor in all their things, and those blessings have come through. People say, oh, well, that's superstition of the old days. No, that's the reality of people who were not stupid in any way, recognizing that this world is a lot more complicated than just what humanism and our machines can do. Because there's a lot of empires that come up very quickly with a new invention, and then they disappear from the stage of history. Or a lot of empires who have a lot of law and they'll go forward. The comment section does not come on until the whole show is over. You can certainly, if you write things, I can read them as they go, Davey. So just so you know. So let's start by going back a little bit in time. And what I wanted to do today is kind of lay the foundation for what the Atlantic Nation is. And really the Atlantic Nation, in my mind, consists of three groups of people. If you want to think of it this way, you could kind of think of it as the Atlantic, Appalachia, and Laurentia. And for those of you who don't recognize the terms, Atlantic would be the coastline, Appalachia is the hills that connect us, and Laurentia is the inland areas that would basically represent the Great Lakes region. Sometimes I call them agriculture, but that is our people here in the Northeast. And what happened was we've got led on a track where we've gone ahead. Today I'm not going to be talking about politics as far as that goes, Davey, but yeah, they should do a manual count all over the place, and they shouldn't have electronic voting. But this isn't about trying to save America. America's killing itself, as is Canada, as is the world. And the reason why is the purpose of the show today, so that people have a better understanding of that. So what I wanted to say is that these were regions that understood and were close to the land, and they were close to God in a lot of ways, because they understood the uncertainty. Whether you were a mariner working off the coast, a lobsterman in Maine, a crab fisher in Maryland, or perhaps you were living off the the Great Banks of Newfoundland, and you were cod fishermen, you understood that the dangers of the sea and had a respect for the land and the water and for those powers. Or if you live in hill country like I do, sometimes people wonder why I grow a beard and why I do these things, because I am becoming one with the people where I live. So many people who are political philosophers will go to a place and tell people what they must think, their own form of imperialism, because they've read some books, instead of going to the people and asking them how they've lived. When I moved to Maine eventually, as a once Arizonan who has now lived here and lived in the upper New England area for about 5 years, I didn't come here saying, hey, here's how you have to live. I came asking a question because I came to their land and I was asking, how should we live? How do we live? And what I learned is that in Appalachia specifically, there are people who live close to the land. I have a beard because I live in a cold area and because I want to be able to keep warm, and because I am natural. I'm not ashamed of what I am. I am not trying to appear something other than what I'm not. I wear plaid because it's simple dress that honors the traditions of people who came here from the English Isles, or from the British Isles, I should say. And that is why I do those things. And when you look at the way people choose to live here, um, anyway, good morning, everybody. Glad to see you here. What I'm going to say is that that is a big part of what it is too, because you learn to live simply, you learn to live off the land, and you learn that it is a challenge, and some years are better than others, and that you need friends, and you need neighborhoods, and you need communities, and that it is a good life, but it is a challenging life because the land requires work from you, but it is work that gives your life meaning and purpose. And it's not work where you're against anyone, but where you're trying to build something and create something, not just trying to distribute endlessly what's already out there or reappropriate things. And the same to the farmers who come across the Midwest who are in those. I have friends in the UP of Michigan, throughout the Ontario. As we get into Wisconsin, the Iron Range of Minnesota, we get some miners up there, good folk. And in a lot of ways, that's a little bit further in because, but the Atlantic does feed. I should say, the Great Lakes see the St. Lawrence River as an estuary, which feeds into it. And who knows, maybe we will be two different nations when it's all said and done, or maybe we will be one grander nation. I kind of wish we are, because when I think about the Atlantic, what I think about is that it's the connection between the Great Lakes, between New England and the Mid-Atlantic, although the Mid-Atlantic is an occupied territory at present, and we'll talk about that. And that the natural boundaries of it are probably the Potomac River, the Ohio River, and the Missouri River, although it probably would extend a little bit south of that because there's an uneasy borderland, call it the southern border of Virginia, Kentucky, going to about the Rocky Mountains. And that's what it is. I mean, within North America, north of Mexico, you do have three great nations. You have the Northeastern nation, you have the Southron nation, and you have the West Coast nation that may or may not include the frontier of the Rockies and what's within that. But I do recognize the limitations of that, and we could draw them smaller, and of course people do. But this is one of the things that's interesting when you think about the history of nations, how these were filmed. Long before Rome ended up being a gigantic city, it was a backwater that remembered itself and built itself into something great. And in the same way, before Spain went through the Reconquista, it was a bunch of Visigoths who were living in the northern kingdoms like Basque and what do you call it? Leon would be, Navarre would be the actual kingdoms, before they reconquered a continent over 500 years. Or the Macedons who came down into Greece, even though Athens was originally a nowhere or something. So this is one of the things that I think is really important to understand, that sometimes it is the backwaters that build the future. Or, if you want to think of the history of things, you look at what was happening in Wessex was no one's idea of something, and yet the British Empire rose to rule the world. Or when Orleans, they went and they supported Joan of Arc, and Paris had been conquered, and you saw the thought that England would, under Norman leadership, actually take ownership of that whole area. And I could name country after country if you like. Prussia was a backwater. Moscow was a provincial town. But these were areas that had a sense of themselves. Because what you find is that the great cities of the world are not the places that ultimately end up running and creating new worlds for us to live in. They're the places where worlds go ahead to destroy. So that is one of the things that becomes really important, that you understand, because what we're doing here is we're trying to figure out what that new world looks like and how that comes together. And that's why I'm up here in Maine, because this is the heart of the Atlantic in a lot of ways. Maine, New Brunswick, Quebec, and we'll talk about why those places are. This is why New Albion started up here between Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire. We're not in Boston. Why? Because Boston's part of the global system. Same with Montreal. It's the same thing. It's run by bankers, big universities. It's a global empire against all all the nations of the world. And that's one of the things you have to understand. It's this idea that multiculturalism means that there's one culture. It's that you force this culture on people, and we don't want that. That is not who we are. That's not the hippies of Vermont, the libertarians in New Hampshire, the lobstermen of Maine. The people up in Cape Breton, or the potato farmers over there in Prince Edward Island, or the Quebecois who are over in the Chaudière Valley. None of those, but the cities have decided to become part of a global empire. And this is the fight of the future, and this is why the Atlantic nation is not just a nominal concept. A future is coming in the not too distant visioning, where you're going to be forced to be part of a hive, where you're going to be forced to go centralize and urbanize and be locked down, and you won't be able to live for yourself. You will be forbidden to live for yourself, in fact, and you will be provided sustenance by a system that says you have to serve us. You have to link yourself to an Internet of Things and technology. You have to vaccinate yourselves with whatever substances we want to push in you. You have to indoctrinate yourself with whatever TV. You say the wrong idea, you're guilty of hate crimes, and you'll be re-educated. It is a battle for the freedom of man and the decency of man and the dignity of the Lord, to be honest with you, because they're going to go after Christians. Because why? Because we don't worship the state. We don't worship the elites who run it. We want to be free and sovereign people, and that's the way forward. And as we've had a lot of interesting arguments, and if you haven't joined our Telegram group, t.me/Atlantic Homeland, one of the things we've discovered is, and I've discovered, is we have a lot of people in there who don't necessarily agree on a lot of things. And that's okay, because we seem to agree on certain things. We agree that we live in places that are not arbitrary, that bring us together. We understand that where we live has meaning and purpose. The nature around us is important, and the culture and heritage has value to us. We understand that we do not want to impose everything we believe on others. There are certain things we want to protect. Absolutely. We agree with certain liberties, and we agree with certain core concepts. I've articulated them many times: reason, nature, grace, and loyalty. But we also understand that that which governs least in a lot of ways governs best. And by that, I mean not that one group or one ideology is better. I mean that where you live should decide how you live. And if you live on a potato farm, you don't need the same rules that if you live in a rural hamlet. And the other thing we've all come to agree upon is that cities are bad. And so as a part of this going forward, we're going to talk about deurbanization as part of the Atlantic agenda, not because I'm going to force it, but because circumstances are. With the pandemic rising, with civil unrest on the horizon, with all of these issues out there, what we've seen is the great abandonment of the big cities. How many New Yorkers have spread out into the Hudson River Valley, the Adirondacks? Even up here in Maine, we see it. Same with people escaping Boston, escaping other areas. And what does that mean? It means the same thing it meant during the Great Plagues of the just before the Renaissance launched. And that what happens is people flee from cities because they are not civilization. Rather, they are the material accretion of wealth that comes, that is the end of civilization, because it is not a dynamic force. It is simply the ossification of what were once potent ideas. And this is what happens. Good things happen in small numbers. You don't believe me? How many books of genius have been written where you have 50 authors? One could argue the Bible, but beyond that, you don't have things work out better when you go down those paths. Instead, you need people to be able to live close to the land, have an awareness of the earth, be able to be working within their communities, and understand that it's going to be dealt with differently. Like, take these lockdowns. Nobody wants to see another lockdown. Nobody wants to see countrywide lockdowns that destroy businesses, that destroy hope, that lead to despair. And yet towns should be able to decide, families should be able to decide, and at that level, that's where it needs to be decided. And if we weren't all on top of each other and we had a sane policy, you'd lock the borders down on the outside, keep the people safe on the inside, and you could go forward, and that would be good. But this is the sort of thing we're not allowed to do, because we have to listen to people who make decisions for all of us. So whether you're a hippie in a commune living over in, let's see, where would be a good place to pick? Over in Montpelier, over in Vermont, or whether you are living in a little quiet vision, like maybe St. Stephen over in New Brunswick, or, a cod fisherman living off St. John's over there in Newfoundland. Or, my good friends who make the poutine down in Saint Georges. All of these things are different, and we could do something different, and we should do something different, because we need to walk away from what's happening. We need to walk away from a world of insanity, and we're going to have to make that choice soon. And it doesn't matter whether you were a Trump supporter or a Biden supporter. Operation Warp Speed was going to be imposed by Trump for AstraZeneca just as quickly as Biden's new solution will be input with a 4 to 6 week lockdown in support of this idea that we're going to go ahead and have Pfizer be in charge. The same people are bankrolling both sides, and the same people are looking for these fights. This idea that the left and right wing are going to work. I mean, this is one of the conversations I've had to have a lot lately. Why do nations form? And everyone's like, well, I have the right ideology. Who gives a damn what your ideology is? Has communism made a great nation? Has fascism made a great nation? Has ideology ever made a great nation? When nations have come forward, they've come forward in spite of the political philosophies behind them. They came forward because a group of people who share bonds of kinship, usually of language, a common land, and a desire to work with one another recognize that there is value and meaning to this. Often the most stable ones have come together in support of language and a common faith and kinship groups, and we achieve say, well, Tom, that's just civic nationalism. Look, I understand that you need people who share bonds of identity to work together, but in and of itself, you've never seen a nation form on that basis, and you won't because it's not enough to say, hey, I look like you, or that I share the same R1A or R1B genes. People don't organize that way. They organize organically based upon what they believe. And what we believe and what we have to remember is our land sustains us, that it was a consecration we made in good faith, and that we need to simplify our lives massively and recognize it. That's why I go around looking like this. I wear a beard because I can fit along just as easily with a redneck up here, well, hillbilly really, up in Maine as much as I would with an Amish farmer or with a lobster fisherman, one of those guys who's used to fighting with the sea, because the city is the enemy. And I say this not because I dislike city folk, but because they have learned helplessness. They have become part of a hive, part of a collective. And that one of those things that has been really difficult is to get people to understand that we don't need a bigger system. We don't need people who are more specialized. We don't need more technology. We don't need more innovation. What we need is more connection, and that's what's missing. And it's that fabric that's needed. I don't need to tell you we need more libertarian philosophy or more communist philosophy or fascist or any of these things. What I need to tell you is you need to recognize that your well-being is invested in the people where you live, whether you live in Greenville, Maine, Greenville, North Carolina, or wherever you live. You have to figure out how you're going to organically connect to people. And that's a question of cooperation, consensus, and community. And that's what we need to begin building now. And what that means is a massive decentralization and survival. And I do believe the Lord is fair and he teaches those lessons. And I do believe calamities are coming. I do believe we're going to see natural calamities in the coming years that are going to be terrible. I believe the pandemic will rise again, although I don't believe that's entirely organic, but that's okay. And I do believe that we are going to see a push hard made by the people in cities, where you're going to see things like these 5G towers will be ubiquitous. The Internet of Things will be everywhere. Thanks, Josh. I'm glad to see you here. And God bless. God bless everyone who's here this morning. And I think you're going to see that we will not be given choices. Instead, we will be given mandates and force. And the question is, will we resist? And the answer is we must. And by resistance, do I mean we need to take up arms and fight? I hope it doesn't come to that, but who knows? But what I do know is we don't have to comply. We don't have to agree. And we don't have to say just because a whole bunch of people got together supposedly and signed ballots, these people are in charge of us. We have the option to dissemble what exists around us. And that's the challenge that each of us has to do, because whomever is in charge in Washington, what it is it's a global empire. And the question is, do you want to be part of it? And for those who don't, we need to do things locally. And I have a lot of listeners who listen who are not from here. I have a lot of friends in Oregon. I know we have people from Alabama who listen to this. And, I draw lines on maps, right? And I tell you why the North goes one way and the South goes another. But who knows? Maybe those lines, I don't have it exactly right. That's a conversation. Lord knows if you had looked in 1770, you might not have thought that, 20 years later, you'd see more in common with Charleston, South Carolina, and Boston, Massachusetts than between Boston and Halifax. But these are the accidents of history. Nonetheless, for us up here in the Northeast, and when I look at that borderland, which is kind of Virginia, Kentucky, Missouri, what I recognize is that our land makes our people. And that if you look down south where, Spanish is used heavily, where you have Caribbean culture, where you have in a lot of ways, where you have the deep south swamper culture, the Acadians are not the Cajuns, they're different people at this point, and that happens. That's okay. The Spanish aren't the Portuguese either. There's similarities and there's kinships over history, but this is the process of nation making. When we came over here, we had this idea and we were going to put things together. And what happened is you saw the individuals settled a frontier and were able to break away from an empire that didn't work. And we went ahead and created land grants, just like you see the migration of people over time. But we never saw the creation of a proper nation. We saw the concepts of ideas and ideologies. We saw the concepts. And thank you for the person who gave me the money, by the way. Appreciate that. It's very kind of you. God bless. Um, but we saw what ended up happening was the creation of these different groups, and it didn't necessarily make sense other than to fill things out. And then we had the success of an empire. We grew very quickly, but like most empires, you grow quickly. Then there is a time when you come back. People forget that Byzantium ended up lasting for 1,000 years after Rome fell. And why? Because it found itself back at its center. And mind you, there was bureaucracy and there were problems, but there were also a lot of times of vitality as well. And this is where we're at. Now we're at a point in North America where we need to figure out what makes sense. And so I want to talk about where I see us needing to go and what the core of this is. And I'm going to pick three places to pick: Maine, New Brunswick, and Quebec. And I picked them very clearly for different reasons. Maine is a memory of what the Atlantic used to be, of the idea of small towns, of the idea that we'd live in communities that made sense. When you live in a city of 500,000 or, God forbid, 5 million people, you're no longer living in a place that has its own identity in the same way. You're living in a place that has a sort of polyglot identity, where if you go to Boston, it's the same if you go to, in a lot of ways, if you go to Paris, if you go to Los Angeles, to Tokyo, even though the cultures change, the basic mode of being is the same, where people become like ants. And the question is, do you want to become part of a collective, or do you want to be part of a community? Would you rather be in a small town like Newport used to be, or, if you want to use for Massachusetts people, Nantucket, or something like that, where you actually can know people and you can connect? And once upon a time, we used to understand that. And what happens is, without fail in history, a crisis comes and it destroys cities. Rome was about, I think, 2 million people at its height, and yet by the time we hit the Middle Ages, it had shrunk to under 100,000 people. And why was that? Because cities didn't make sense anymore, because all of the action, all the energy went away from there. It was not a safe place to live. It was not a good place to live. It was not a place that sustained the land. And that's one of the things we've got to look for, that shift away from making America great or keeping America great to making the Atlantic good or making the South good. And you guys all have different ideas. If you live on the West Coast and they have a harder fight than a lot of people, you'll have to figure out what that is, because you grew up without an ideology to guide you. You grew up with this idea of rampant individual liberty, and unfortunately, that is not a collective basis. The South has a different idea, caught up in largely Baptist Christianity and an idea of certain agrarian cultures. And up here in the Northeast, we are a nation that has always been and will always be governed by the sense of good social order. Our Puritan roots have been perverted and corrupted by naturism, and I say that not against nature, but the idea that we worship creation over the creator, and by this idea of materialism that came in maybe through the Dutch influence in New York, or Unitarianism, which I would say is a complete perversion. It's pantheistic religion that came out of the Puritan. I mean, if you actually understand the history of how Congregationalism moved aside, you understand history of what happened in the United States, that we moved away from being a godly nation and a folk that was close to the land, to the idea that, well, we would harness nature and serve nature, but we would also have our own idea of social gospel morality. And eventually the gospel disappeared from social living, because it always does, because when it comes to expediency versus God, if your whole idea is that the purpose of God is to do that which is good in this world, you'll get lost instead of serving the Lord. And the way you serve the Lord is by keeping close to his creation, to be sure, but you also have to be aware and be in the word and be aware of these things. And we used to be deeper in our philosophies. And in a lot of ways, this is why I include our friends in New Brunswick. They lived simpler, they lived closer to the land, and they understood that. But I include the Quebecois for another reason. And people will say, why do you include the French? Because they remember, je me souviens, they remembered who I am. I am who I remember. That's literally, I remember myself. That's what it says on their license plates. And why does it say that? Because they know who they are, and we don't know who we are. We haven't asked it. We've been so busy acting, we haven't learned about being. And that's one of the reasons why, frankly, I think we need to learn French, if not Spanish, but I prefer French, because when you study a Latin language, you learn there's two different ways to be, to be. It is to exist or to be the essence of, right? So you have this idea, you'd say, would it be Sarah and a star? It would be in Spanish, would it be? But the idea is that on one hand, there's what you do that makes you who you are, but then there's also what you are. And we have forgotten who we are because we never pause. We're always active, we're always doing things. And there's nothing wrong with laboring for our times. But when work becomes an end unto itself, and let's be honest, as Americans especially, and Canadians to a lesser extent, North Americans kill ourselves every year trying to prove what we can do. Why? Because we're individuals, we're in competition with one another. I'm not in competition with you. You are my brothers and sisters, hopefully in Christ, but if nothing else in these lands that we reside. And I'm like, why are we fighting each other? Why are we fighting for these people? They're not for us. Why are we fighting for these philosophies? So, I'm supposed to fight for what? For communism versus fascism, so someone can tell me what to do. I'm supposed to fight for Democrats versus Republicans, so I can pick whether we're going to have a warfare state or a welfare state. I'm not fighting for that. I might fight for Maine. I would fight for my hometown. I'm not going to go forward and do these things because they don't make sense to me. What makes sense to me is how do I build something in my community? And I don't want to see giant monopolistic corporations run this. And I don't want to have Byzantine government bureaucracies run this. And I don't want these one-size-fits-all philosophies that are the end of history. It doesn't work because you know what? If you live on a lake, it's different than if you live on the ocean. And if you live in a valley, you don't grow things the same you do in the field. You live where you are. And this is one of the things we need to learn, how to simply be, but we don't know because we are told we're in the process of being America, the ideal, idea state, that we are our beliefs. And that's certainly true to some extent. But you know what? God gives new challenges. And when your belief in man supersedes the idea that creation is an act of worship for which we should be grateful and blessed, then what happens is we get destroyed because we believe too much in ourselves. And it's vanity and pride that we have become so detached from the idea that being a good people is actually an important thing. We don't care if we're good. We don't care if we're decent. We just care that we take out those who stand in our way. And whether you're an individual capitalist or a communist crusader, you guys think you're fighting each other. You're not. You're on the same side. I mean, you just basically are saying, I'm going to beat you up till you tell me what to do. And how do you go around that? Well, let's look to our friends, the Quakers from Pennsylvania, place I spent a lot of time, learned a lot, and from the Amish. You keep the things out of your life that you don't want to make sense, and you learn to talk to people and come to consensus where you can. And there are certain things we do need to agree on as foundational principles. I agree with that. Like, for instance, I talk about abortion. That makes people mad. Why? Because life is valuable. If you live in a culture that values life and you think life is sacred, people will respect you and you'll respect yourselves. Whereas if you treat life as an inconvenience and a way to economic or philosophical freedom, you're going to go ahead and have devalue. You need to learn to value people more and ideas less. And then you look at nature. What is the nature of how people really are? That's why we talk about these things. And you look at that and you use scripture as guidance. It's been around for 2,000 years for a reason. And you look at the way people genuinely relate. And you don't always judge by the exception. Do you allow some leeway? Of course you do. There's a degree of liberty we want to have. And everyone loves a crazy kook. And that makes it interesting. And sometimes the crazy kook is right. I should know. I play the role every day, even though I'm probably one of the most sane people you ever meet. But it's one of the things you have to learn in that battle is that just because you permit things doesn't mean you want to have a whole social order based on indulging whoever's the craziest screaming person, which we do these days. And we do it because the people on top find it useful to divide us into all these different little brackets. So I don't really like division, which makes it weird that I'm a secessionist, but I like things to have organic development. And up here, we're going to keep working on it, and I'm going to push harder. And I've been very fortunate. I want to say thank you to my different friends. Within the Atlantic Nation, in the Atlantic Homeland group we have over there on Telegram, we have people who go from left to center to right of center, and we've all come together in decency and common cause. Something that's been lost, something that's very precious, with an understanding that certain things don't work. And here seems to be the consensus. We don't want to have a governmental system that dictates everything we do in our lives, but we do agree there are certain moral values that need to be upheld. We also agree that economics isn't all about the accretion of wealth or the control over other people, but that people should have a basic level of decency on which to live and have work that has meaning. but that not be forced. And we have a respect for human beings that are within this. And we also seem to increasingly understand that there needs to be a common set of beliefs and that you can't just endlessly import more people to change things. Not like Trudeau has done up in Canada for years because he doesn't want to have to deal with another referendum where Quebecois would want to, God forbid, defend their French use of the language. Or, up here in Maine where Janet Mills just keeps dumping Somalis on here and says, you're a bigot if you don't love Islam. I don't love Islam. I hate Islam. I think it's a terrible, barbaric religion. And I've said that many times. And I know that Muslims don't agree with me. That's fine. That's what they have the whole Middle East for. And this is not their territory. And if you let them outnumber you, they'll be in charge of it. And why? Because ideas do matter to the extent that your cultural beliefs matter far more than your political ideology. And your culture is the truth you're willing to defend. So what am I willing to defend? I'm willing to defend the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is that you're going to go ahead and treat people decently. You're going to love your enemy. You're going to love your neighbor, but you're also going to adhere to certain rules, as expressed aptly in the Ten Commandments and throughout the words of Christ. Like, for instance, where he says, love God first and then love your neighbor next as your enemy. And that's one of those things. And I'm trying to love my enemies, and I know they don't love me. They put me on hate lists, and they say I'm this horrible person, and they present me as this awful, evil person. And I know even my friends, they go to me sometimes, and they're like, Tom, why don't you go out there? You could go get dressed in a suit and go to... Yeah, I could go out there. I could go play the version of Richard Spencer or someone that would be more compelling and more reasonable, but it's not what the people want, and ultimately it wouldn't work. I can't impose upon you to become the sort of people you would want to accomplish my ideology. I'd be just as bad as they am, as they are. What you need to do is you need to understand who the people actually are, connect them organically, and put them together. And that's what we've been doing with this Atlantic project. And I have to say, I'm excited about it. I know it's a long slog, but I know things are going to fall apart as well because you can see already where we're at. Who knows if this country will even be together a month from now? I mean, because if you go ahead, on one hand, you either enable a theft of the country. Thank you, Bear, for that. I am vaguely aware, but not deeply aware of Owen, so maybe I'll have to get more familiar. I'm so bad at... In fact, I really just try to develop my thoughts on my own. I don't watch a lot of videos. I read a lot of books, but I don't just generally spend too much time on here. I spend time kind of just thinking through the questions and interacting with people. But I'm always interested in an idea, especially in summation. Although if you put a 90-minute video in front of me, I'll just be candid with you. It won't get watched. The odds are nine out of 10 times, and usually like 98 out of 100. Not because I think it's not worthwhile. It's just that I choose to spend my time with my wife, my reading, and all the studies. I mean, I have so many things I already don't do. I mean, my hobby of theology, I let linger, and I can't work on French like I want to. I mean, I kind of wish I had more ability to focus, but you guys will laugh. I've been spending the last couple of days doing nothing but reading old Star Wars sci-fi books just because I needed to get my mind somewhere else because I was in a bad place for a while. And we all were. I mean, after the election, I sat and thought, do I want to fight people who disagree with me? And I'm like, no, because they're just as deceived, right? You go out there, oh, I voted for Biden. It's great. Yeah, so Bernie got screwed out of the election probably by the same hammer and scorecard system. And now you see Dick Cheney coming back in. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss, right? But that's the nature of this system. This is what happens. Yeah, old sci-fi is awesome, Joseph. I'll tell you one of my favorite things that C.S. Lewis's space trilogy says the old history of the Earth is the Numenor stories of J.R.R. Tolkien. If you haven't read the Paralandra trilogy, I highly recommend it. It's for a more optimistic time. And I suspect, actually, if you understand the archaeology of it, there's things in there that hint at things you're not allowed to know because there are times before time that really are fascinating. You read works of things like Joseph Campbell or whatever, you can go back in time and find some of these things. I guarantee you the elites know this. It's the old Truman quote, right? The only interesting thing you ever learn in the world is the history you're not allowed to know. And I spend a lot of time studying that. I find that more fascinating than dealing with people, by and large, because people are pretty awful. We're awful to each other, and we're awful because we're not governed by anything other than our own naked ambition. And I want to move away from that. So I'm going to try to be follow the Christian example. I'm not going to say Christ-like. Lord knows I'm too much a sinner to even claim that conceit. But I'm going to try to follow the example, and I'm going to reach out. I'm going to talk to people, and we're going to talk up here in Maine. And when they decide they're going to tell us what to do, we're going to say no. And when they come after us and say you got to fight for it, we say okay. And that's what it's going to be. And I think it's going to come from the city folk. And I feel bad for the people on our coast because I will tell you, there's a whole group from Portland, Maine, down to Boston, through a lot of Connecticut, Hartford, certainly New Haven, those places, definitely through New York, Philadelphia, Washington, all of those places, Baltimore, where they're just lost. And I think that deconstructing the cities is going to be necessary, and I think it's going to happen organically. I think that when crises come, whether it be political conflict, whether it be invasion, whether it be the pandemic, if God forbid we have another thing launch, and they will, because they don't want people who aren't there, unless people agree to join the hive and all go ahead and use those as centers from which a few people can go out into the countryside parks. What you're going to see is a push against the rural folk, and the rural folk are the people who are decent. It's no accident in the Lord of the Rings that you had to find Frodo from the Shire be the one of moral character who could carry the ring. Aragorn, as much as he's a glorious hero, couldn't do it. Boromir, who in a lot of ways was a tragic hero as well, who couldn't go ahead and hold that together, was the same. Or even like a great and learned man, consider Gandalf our MIT, right? That he couldn't do it either. He could certainly lead the way, but it was the moral vision of people who understood and had that connectedness to saying, wait a second, this is simple folk wisdom. And folk is the root of a nation, a people who share a common identity. Mainers know what they're about. Vermonters know what they're about. New Hampshire people know. The Quebecois know for sure. We ultimately have, or people, good to see you, John. Glad you're here. People up in the Adirondacks know. People in New Brunswick certainly know. You go up to Cape Breton, they know. You go to Boston, they don't know. You go to New York City, they don't know. You go to Toronto, they don't know. Montreal can't even decide what language they want to speak. What happens is that you put too many people together and it doesn't work. And it's not to say I don't want to say everything about cities are bad. There are things I like about cities. They just don't outweigh the things I don't like. And so these are some of the things that I think are really important to go forward, because you're going to have to think about these questions. And it's not a abstract, Tom's just telling you philosophy. Abstractions is me telling you that policy, laws, and programs put out by people are going to have any connection to reality. Reality is that wealthy people are going to get contracts, screw you over, and you're going to have to suffer whatever rules they place over you. What I'm offering you as an alternative is an ideology that is not an ideology. It's a simple reconnection with the land you live in, the people around you, and the idea that you don't have to submit to this sort of rule over you. You don't have to submit the law. You live under grace. The Lord gave that to you. Who is man to take that away from you? And look at the Amish who managed to live in blithe lack of awareness of this. And why? Because an election went the wrong way, or because an election's being stolen? Okay, look, I feel horrible about it too. And in theory, I want to fight for it. But the truth of it is, the same stupidity happens no matter who's in there. And that's why it needs to be different. That's why we need to be different. And we need to find who we are friends with. And you know what? Maine is a starting place. I know we can get along well with New Hampshire. I'm talking to Vermont. Can we get along with them? Maybe. Do I want to tell them to not be hippie green peaceniks? No. Do I want them to find Christ? God willing, they will. But you know what? There are things we can negotiate on. And I can talk to people in Vermont more easily. I can talk to people in Boston or Le Quebecois. Even though my French is terrible, I understand the people who live in the Chaudière Valley 1,000 times better than I understand the people who live in Cambridge. And why? Because they want to be part of the world that's being made. That's one world order. That's the new world order. That's a globalist world. And that is the thing that ideology will lead you to, because you're going to fight of control over the empire. And whether you come from a left-wing perspective or a right-wing perspective, the question is, do you want to separate out the Shire? And do you want to throw the ring away? And what is the ring? The ring, in this sense, is the idea that there's one ideology to lead you. We just aren't that smart. I'm not that smart. I'm not that wise. I don't know what's best for Waterville, Maine, let alone, the whole United States. I have an idea what might work good in Greenville. And, if you have leadership that recognized in an area where they said, okay, we're going to give power to the towns, keep money where it's at, not let things get too big that's out of control, you could have a region do pretty good for itself. And that's what you learn in small town living, that you don't want to get too big for your britches. And that's what I think the answer is. And it's same with businesses. I mean, how many of you have you ever known, and I know this is something you can relate to, whether you're a city person or a country person, a restaurant chain, maybe it started 10, 15 years ago, and there was one family that owned it, but then they started opening up new branches because, hey, they're going to make money and they're popular, but it's never quite as good because you don't have the same cook and you don't have the same restaurant, and it becomes all about what it's supposed to be. And before long, you have 30 different restaurants where everything's the same, and you're like, Yeah, they used to be pretty good, but we just don't go there anymore. And why don't you? Because it's nothing special. There's no heart in it. It's just going through the motions. And that's where we're at in the United States of America. And I'd argue for Canada. We're not even going through the motions. We've been dead for a long time getting a blood transfusion of people from other places. And we've been saying, well, we have life because we bring in these other people. We bring them in to make up for the fact we have an education system that doesn't teach people how to learn other than to go ahead and pay homage to the system. And we've used all of our wealth to spend our inheritance like a drunkard or a reprobate, and that's what we've done with our country. And we just bring in more and more people. And look, I'm not saying that people who come from other places are bad. It's not about that. It's about the fact that their way of living is not our way of living. But we have adopted their way of living because we don't know what our way of living anymore is, because we're not even allowed to ask the question. We're just supposed to shut up and go ahead and not make any judgments. And once upon a time, we did have a way of living. It was a good way of living because it built all this wealth, and it built it not because we had a great government. Lord knows we had lots of lousy leaders. It built it in spite of that. And a great government, if it ever came into existence today, would be one that would be very slight. It would bring people together in culture and unity and a sense of things. That's why New Albion's a kingdom. Why? Because you need personal connections. And one of the weird ironies and one of the possible potential benefits of technology, although I'm not sure it'll work out this way, is that people can connect organically. You have to know people. If you're going to have someone lead you, they're going to have to be someone you can talk to and trust in. And look, I'm not here to tell you that I'm necessarily the guy. I'll try if you ask me to. But the thing about it is, it can't be about ideology. Because if you're that consistent with what you believe, you obviously don't care about what's happening to people. You don't care. Thank you, John. I appreciate that. It's not about what's happening to people. It's about what you want to impose on people. And look, I believe in vision. I'm out here to speak the gospel every day. That's what I go out there and do. And I always put Christ at the center of what I'm doing because he's smarter than I am and he's better than I am. But I do that in a way where I say, hey, we still have to live in this world. We still have to live with one another. And if we can go ahead and agree on some basic core decent principles, maybe we could do something pretty good. And you know, I would submit that there are these areas in America where you can see that happen. You know, the Highlands here in Maine is one area of that. You know, the Ozarks of Arkansas is another area. You know, the uplands of New York, not New York, the Adirondacks would work to some extent, but like if you go up to northern Idaho, another example, or the UP of Michigan, there are these places. And so let's talk about cities for one second, because I know I shoot on them hard. There are urban neighborhoods who remember themselves, and they could, if they chose to break up cities into microstates, they could actually do something good. We've talked about this, but you know, honestly, you don't, it's not a way for people to live. When you're on top of one another, you simply can't understand, you can't appreciate, you can't find contentment the same way you would. So as we go forward into this new year and this new thing, I do think things are going to fall apart, and I think it'll happen quickly. I do, since people asked, I do think there was extensive vote fraud in a lot of different directions, but I think fraud is the nature of a large corrupt imperial state. And I think we need to do something different, and you need to have a mindset. What are you? And I'm not asking you what do you believe. I'm not asking if you're left wing or right wing. I'm asking you where your loyalty is. Is it to your family? Is it to your faith? Is it to your folk? Is it to your town where you live? Is it to your location? You know, for me as a Mainer, to New England, to the far Northeast. And I do believe that if something happens, we have long been the idea center of the country. But that vitality that was once in Boston has died and become part of a global empire. And that therefore, if a change happens, it will happen in places like Burlington and Concord and Augusta and Bangor and Montpelier and Fredericton and St. John, and maybe Halifax. You know, we'll see. Places, but not just that, smaller places too. You know, even the crazies in Camden and Belfast on the coast. You know, the ideologues in Keene. But if all of us come together and say, "Hey, we can do something differently," and these are the conversations that are needed, and just say, "No, you're not going to force us to be all locked down. No, you're not going to force us all to take a vaccine. No, you're not going to say it's for our own good, because we do want order, but we want to shape that order, and we want to shape that order on a moral sense that allows us to keep our dignity and to allow our intellect to be a part of this, because reason is an Atlantic value, that we're going to use logic to this. And we're not just going to say, we're going to do this because you support it. And yeah, we do value our nature and we want to be close to it. We're not going to let you take it away from us and say that you have to be part of technology. And yeah, we're going to recover our grace. And it's not just being decent to people, it's recognizing that grace is more than humanism. It's the idea that once upon a time we were land settled in divinity. And so I pray every morning to reconsecrate the Atlantic to this area. And I know my southern friends do, and I feel bad for my friends out west who grew up with parents who did not teach you that God was involved, and that was a terrible failure. So when you see those things happening in Portland and San Francisco and Seattle that happen, you understand that it was a failure of us believing in our own wealth and prosperity over our decency. And that failure sits on a lot of places, a little bit on the South, but mostly on New England. And we have to own that. And we have to remember as we go forward in a new great awakening that we made false divisions. We said, oh, state is here and belief is here. It's not. It's never been. All these divisions are fake, or the corporations are here and capitalism is here, or I should say government is here. It's not. I mean, look at it. It's a revolving door in DC. Why do you think you have all those like three-letter, and whether it's an agency or a business contractor, it's the same thing. What they do is it's just money that revolves between them, or same thing down on Wall Street. All of these places and all these corrupt industries, the credit cards of Delaware, and the Northeast has to own this stuff. The insurance industries that used to be in Hartford, all the various firms that were in Boston that ran over on Beacon Street and all that. I mean, all of these places, or the big five banks that ran out of Montreal, or now they move in Toronto. That is what this region has become, but it's not what this region was supposed to be. And the reclamation has to start here, that we are the dark heart that needs to be stabbed out of existence, because we have been concerned with usury rather than decency. And we have gone through the motions, we have gone through the genuflection that you would have, almost like a sort of form of simony, where you would go forward and you do this false, repentance, where you give money, like you're paying people off as an indulgence, like you did in the old medieval Catholic Church, because your church has pictures of God without his presence. And now it's a time to bring something back, and that means you have to walk out, and find this way. And that's what I encourage everyone to do now, and you don't have to agree with everything I think to understand that the system is bad. It does not serve you, and you do not have to offer your consent. You do not have to offer your endorsement, and you should go ahead and try to find a way to be more organically involved with where you are. And it doesn't mean you have to look like me and sound like me. I choose to do that because I choose to live close to the culture, and I choose to live close to the people. So if I go ahead and I wear plaid and I wear a big beard, it's because I am trying to be one with the people who are here, because I want to have an understanding of who they are and who we are. Because just much like you guys like classic sci-fi, Paul Atreides was not the guy who could redeem Arrakis. It was Paul Muad'Dib. And why does it happen? Because he became one with the Fremen. As he says in his final speech, our ways. And he understood that. And I understand New England's our ways, because I chose to come here. I chose to leave Arizona because I didn't like the rootless cosmopolitan nature of it any more than I liked that, Phoenix is an aberration on the land in a lot of ways. Not because the people are bad, but because it's not a natural place for a city, especially with the Salt River being so dammed up. But in the same way, that same thing has been imposed on all of our great places, whether it's Chicago, Detroit, Toronto, Montreal, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Baltimore, all of those big cities. And so moving away from that is a big part of it. So, and for the good of the people, by the way, I would totally support using some of those resources to kind of make a fabric patchwork of small towns. And if you want to live as a crazy left-wing crazy, that's fine. Go for it. If you want to live in a total right-wing, sort of survivalist camp, great. And, we can do that. And we can do that in a way that works really good, but we got to start small. And we got to start small and be consistent and have rules that make place. I'm sure Central Kentucky feels the same way. Lexington's a wonderful place. Horse farmers, you go through there. I spent a lot of time driving through Eastern Kentucky. And for what it's worth, we consider Kentucky and Virginia as kindred spirits to us, because the Ohio River is an integral land here. That's it. And we're going to need some good hard men to do that. We're going to need people like John and others to come in, sheepdogs, and people who served in the military, who served in law enforcement, and people who've never served a day in their life, but who understand these things. And I will send out a letter a word of reconciliation to our southern friends. If you chose to walk our path, which I don't know if it works for your climate, I know it doesn't work for Florida, but I know there are good people in places like Tennessee and North Carolina. Maybe we can have that conversation. I mean, there have been times we can do things together. I think the West is a different world. I've talked to a lot of Westerners, but the North and the South have a long history, and I spend a lot more time worrying about how to reconcile with our Canadian friends because I've spent enough time in places like Tennessee and in New Brunswick to know we have a lot more common with our people north rather than south. Nonetheless, it's not because I think we are better. It's I know we're different because our lands are different, our habits of living. And to our friends down there, you guys usually have an emphasis on individualism and liberty that I think we have been seduced by as well. And perhaps if you want to go for a good order, that would be better. But instead, there's something about that climate that makes people different for the land. If it's something you're interested in, will we go forward? But I think down south, they have a different battle and a different reconciliation and a different ethnic group. And much like we saw Spain and Portugal come out of Iberia, even though it's very odd that that happened, I do think that the North and South organically are two different civilizations. And I think the line is probably between, I mean, I don't know exactly where it is, and it's up to the people themselves to decide it, but I would say it's probably somewhere along the Virginia, sort of Tennessee southern border. Although it could be as high as the Mason-Dixon line, the Potomac, the Ohio River. I just know because of where people have moved, and I know I've spent time in the Shenandoah Valley. I understand those folk pretty well. I spent time in West Virginia, and a lot of time in West Virginia, actually. So I kind of think that's a better fit. And same thing as you go out west, you get to where those lines are in Missouri. Maybe you draw it somewhere in the Dakotas, because I know Montanans think of themselves as the West, but North Dakota is kind of different. And by the time you get to the Great Lakes, it's separate. But I wouldn't want to see a separate central region, only because I think it would lead to more conflict. We'd end up with the Northeast being France and the Midwest being Germany, with the sad history that went forward, in the same way that things broke apart when Charlemagne's empire fell. So I would encourage our brothers in the Midwest, but I will honor their thoughts. And I could see a future where, you see the Northeast and Canada kind of come together. But not because you have Governor Cuomo and Governor Baker and all these pinheads going ahead and supporting it. You're using I'd rather go smaller than bigger if better. So that's why I focus my efforts more on Upper New England, because I know Lower New England's seduced right now by this sort of threat, and that's why I focus that more on my friends in upstate New York and that sort of Buffalo. Although what happened in Rochester was terrible, and the way the Buffalo police have been treated is terrible, and I'm sure Syracuse doesn't have a good idea. So we'll see if we can get past the Adirondacks. I know if my friend's skeptical here, he'd talk for the Hudson River Valley and how many people don't want in that. And maybe people are ready for a new voice and a new thought. But people are going to tell you I'm a horrible person and I'm a Nazi, and they're going to say all these awful things because I speak truth, and I'm not. It's not like it's not trying to be controversial, but there are things that are true that you don't have to like, and we don't have to go ahead and pretend that we like everything else. We don't have to pretend everyone's just going to get along together. People get along together because they're not there. It's like your in-laws who come over you can't stand. If your mother-in-law or father-in-law, not mine because I love mine, but someone, we always have one in those family, we're around all the time, it wouldn't work. Excuse me as I take a little drink of water here and go forward with this, because I'm just sort of thinking aloud. Because I've had a lot on my mind. I've been really sort of unhappy about things and all that. And you're right, Grand Flash. I actually think I was talking to some of my friends in Texas, and I'm like, why don't you Tejanos, your Texas guys, work with something and admit the reality of your land, and do something where you maybe look at doing something with parts of North Mexico. I mean, people don't know this. Northern Mexico, the northern provinces are on the verge of revolting from the Azteca. And I'm not actually making that up, because they just have such a different way of living between sort of Aztec Guatemalan ways and northern Mexico, which is actually much more oriented toward North America. And does that mean there's a middle America that kind of goes maybe from Los Angeles to Phoenix? I mean, Phoenix would not like that, but that's the reality, through maybe Santa Fe to, through to San Antonio, and then maybe Houston. Maybe you split Texas in two and you put the eastern part with the Confederacy, or maybe Texas is the heart of it. I don't know. These are not my lands. I cannot speak to that. Those people can. And my Texas friends are going to give me a hard time for even mentioning this. But conversely, I would split things. I would split northern Maine from southern Maine, for instance, if that's what was required, and go with something in our northeast, maybe at the Kennebec River or something, because Portland has decided it wants to become part of Boston, because those are the people who are being brought in there, and they're doing what they think is right. They're doing what they're told to do. Let me just move this a little bit because it's not comfortable where I have it. Okay, give me 1 second here. So we'll go forward with that. And but I really think the time is coming where we're going to have to think differently. And who knows, maybe that means the Pines and Lines does have to take the field. Because I will tell you, there are things I'm not going to deal with in unending lockdown, or the idea that I'm not allowed to have commerce because I don't want to be vaccinated. And I think that, we are going to deal with a race war, but it's not necessarily going to be this idea of whites versus blacks or anything that they kind of have tried to provoke, but it's going to be the human race in the sense versus people who want to turn us into technological dweebs, where we're totally contingent and dependent on the system. And there are people in the country who will not accept that. And politics by proxy has been a big part of this. That's why the people who are standing up for Trump, they don't understand. It's not because they love Trump. I mean, maybe some people do, and that Messiah complex that people have about him is creepy and not helpful. But it's more about the idea that there's a way of life that's being threatened, and you have these sort of things happen. And if we lose, we lose, but it won't be the loss of ours. We'll have lived an honest life and have served for what we believe, and that's what's needed. And that's the fighting sanction we're going to need as we head into this dark American winter. I've thought about it. I mean, would you guys want me to write it? I've thought of rewriting a new version of the Declaration of Independence for this time. I have my friends always tell me I think like a Jefferson. I could tell you what needs to be said, and I can tell you the basis on it, but what is worth living for? What's worth walking away? And in this sense, we're not looking for a fight. We're looking to just separate ourselves. And who's willing to do that? And are you willing to go ahead and surrender your partisan identity, your ideological identity, your patriotic identity to be a chance of a people who's closer to God and closer to one another? Because that's the only way we can win. That's the only fight. You need the blessing of the Lord himself for something so improbable, and you need the fellowship of those around you. You need loyalty and grace to be your core values, and then you can use reason and nature. And I don't know if people are ready for that. I think about it a lot, and I don't know if we have time. I mean, because ultimately the thing about it is you can't win the battle in the field. You have to go ahead and win the battle in your mind and your heart and be ready to walk away. Because if you try to fight him in the field, all that's going to happen is you're going to have the usual structures go forward, and you have to go forward almost like Christ did in a lot of ways, and walk into the temple and go ahead and say to your enemies, that's for me, that's walking into Burlington or Lord knows South Portland, and those people hate my guts. And it would be dangerous, but this is where the message needs to go. And I have people who bring it and they say, oh, he's not worth it. And what do you want? You're hardcore commie. Okay, you're going to allow everything and give everyone every bit of money. All right, what does that even mean? You're going to have a bunch of nominal value that's totally disconnected from the land. Or if you're a right winger, you go out there and like, we're going to go ahead and we're going to what? You're going to make a whole bunch of money. That's what it used to be about. I mean, thank God nationalism's moving in a better direction than the idea that just who has the most chips on the table wins. At the end of the day, it's a card game, and then you got to go work the fields. And for the people who are out there, for those three groups of people, I was saying, we're talking water, hill, and land, right? Those are our people. That's the thing that's really been important. Just leave the phrase reciprocity out of the New Atlantic. Look, hi, Kurt. Right? No, I'm not. I believe in reciprocity as a value, but yeah, I don't. I mean, the proprietarians' obsession with the idea that law would save them is the modern Pharisee thing. I feel bad. I like a lot of the guys in terms of what they want, but they go about it the wrong way. No nation has ever been formed from this idea that law is an end unto itself. It's found as organic bonds. I mean, think of nationalism in the last, even radical nationalism. It either comes from one or two things: the expression of faith as a way of dividing people, the expression of language as division, an ethnic sort of background, which is non-racial, which is deeper than that meaning, or it's the idea of a common culture. These are the means by which people separate. It's why the Irish separated from the English, or why the Boers were willing to fight such a war against what was being done to them, if you go back a century, and why they've still been fighting it, honestly, and they've been losing it, sadly, because they've been displaced, with populations who were brought in actually as cheap labor. I mean, people think South Africa was full of Zulus. It wasn't. They were brought in later, and if you know the history of that. But the same thing happens everywhere. And whether it's East Asians being brought into Canada in the West, or South Asians who've been heavily imported into Ontario, or Somalis, into Minnesota, we see this over and over again. That's not good. And it's not good for anyone. It's unstable, and eventually it's going to lead to a fight, or it's going to lead to a genocide. And demography is important, birth rates are important, but we have lost a sense of ourselves because we trust in technology to lead us, and maybe that's the end of history, right? That's the battle we're fighting now. This idea that we're now going to just be cogs in a machine where none of that matters, because ultimately you can go ahead and if you do the wrong thing, you can get zapped down. So it's just one giant global village. We're trying to reenact the Tower of Babel. And what happened the last time the Tower of Babel happened is God confused everything. And I suspect it will happen again, because I do believe the divine is real. I don't believe God is a joke. I mean, I don't think we can imagine something bigger than ourselves unless it actually exists, if you want to get all platonic about it. But I think that we now have an opportunity to demonstrate what we are about. And if men of the West still have character and still have purpose, and it's going to start here, and it's going to start, oddly enough, in the Northeast and maybe the Southeast to some extent. It's not going to start out West because they're too individualistic. They'll fight, but they'll fight the wrong battle. It's not enough to defeat one enemy. And then, that's like fighting for Isildur. It's just not going to go well. You need to do something smart, or if, John's here. He likes wrestling things. It's like you find out at the end it was McMahon. It was me, Austin. It was, the corporation, right? Terrible mixing of metaphors, but yeah, we need to do something better. And I consider it a blessing to each and every one of you who's here and willing to listen and consider the words, whether you agree or disagree. By the way, there's something big here, and I don't have it quite right, and I need you to help me. I need you to help me understand, and it's consensus and it's cooperation, and a king needs a privy council, and I would like a big one. I would like people who could help me understand what it is, this idea that is bigger than myself I've stumbled onto, that maybe we can do up here. And I talk to people. I have much more actually productive conversations, as much offline, people who listen, because they understand that what we have, as much as there's nostalgia in it and there's investment in it, it's a dead end. And look, you have a car you love, you have your girl you dated in high school. We're not children anymore. It's like the Arthur C. Clarke book, it's Childhood's End. It's time for us to grow up. It's time for us to have some nations. And, when Rome fell, you ended up with France and Italy and, the various nations. Well, let's not talk about what happened in the Balkans. That's a problem. But Spain and eventually Portugal. These are nations that have meaning and purpose. Romania, another one that's been decent, actually. Greece at times, although Greece is older. Those sort of things can happen, and we can do so in friendship. And for our Canadian friends up there, I was talking to my friend Sebastian, who sometimes comes in this chat, lives up in Montreal, and I was watching how it looks like a ghost town up there, how it looks like a graveyard, and that there's death in the sense that we have been shut down so much, and we can't do that anymore. Not for this; it's not worth it. And I say that as someone who has a sick wife who's made a courageous decision to go forward. There are threats, there are always dangers, and with a little bit of faith and a willingness to seek out evil and confront it before it takes control, rather than just thinking that good men can do nothing and that's enough, then we can have a little bit of fight. That's it. So my metaphors help people understand quicker. I hope so. I feel like sometimes I trivialize things, but people do understand that, and it's that. So we are in for a horrific winter if there's no economic stimulus. Yeah, no, well, they want us to have a horrible winter. This is the dark winter. Remember, I mean, please understand, if you read books, if you read about what these people talk about, go read the report from Iron Mountain. Go read what is Trilaterals over Washington. Go read. There's a lot of books. Um, Anything by Carol Quigley or Skousen talks about it. What these people do is they understand the psychology of how people are manipulated. They want you to suffer because when you are in pain, you give power over. It's Pavlovian, it's conditioning. They want you to do that. And that's why we don't have stimulus. Everyone knows the economy is being broken. That's the point. Everyone knows that a bad Christmas season will destroy small business in America permanently. That's the goal. And the thing about it is, remember, money, we worship money. We worship mammon, if you want to call it that. And we forget that this nominal value is sort of fake. It's just transactional. We can choose to reset. We can do things. We give ourselves our own debt amnesty. You don't believe me? What happens if no one pays their tax? I'll say, nope, not doing it in this town. Have a full-on tax rule. And honestly, we should have that. Why not? We deserve a reset, but they're going to give us, here's the trick. They will give you the reset, but they're going to give it to you with strings attached. Did you see, some of you guys follow this stuff more closely. The central banks in Germany were saying you should have to pay a 5% luxury tax from working at home now in the future. You see how this is going? They're going to give you the UBI and they're going to pull it back in. And look, I hate central banking. I think it's a corrupt, evil institution. In fact, I know it's a corrupt, evil institution. Usury always has been. And one of the coerced seductions of the West, for which the right should be held primarily responsible. As much as we talk about our moral dignity in terms of fighting for the value of lives and the unborn and all that stuff, or certain, social values, was in allowing people to be quantified so easily. The way we've allowed usury to proliferate and become profligate is absolutely terrible. And it's one of the values the left actually gets right. And we should have conversations with them seriously, not because work doesn't have dignity or you don't deserve to keep certain things. Obviously, you do. But the idea that some people need to be mega billionaires, I mean, do you think Jeff Bezos is and Bill Gates of the world are good? Do you think Gavi running around with the vaccine plans is great? Or you think the Amazon owning, the CIA cloud computing and the Washington Post is in a little bit of conflict of interest and you're just okay with this? And it's actually funny. It's funny this came up because we were talking about 9/11. We were listening to some old music, some System of a Down. We were listening to like a 90s early aughts playlist. And once upon a time, the left and right understood that this idea that, there was centralization of power was something we fought about. We ended the Fed. We didn't like the WTO. There was a struggle, but it was a struggle that was for the decency and dignity of people. And what they did was they made it into victimhood and identity politics. And look, I played the game and I played it defensively, so I can say it very well. We need to get past that. And not that those things don't matter, but we can draw lines where you live here and I live there and you do what you want and I do what I want. And, within limits that I think are decent human values, we can probably have a lot of opening. And it's a big land. There's a lot of opportunities. But that's one of those things that we need to be aware of it. But yeah, Operation Dark Winter. I mean, that's why I think it's actually interesting. The person Trump brought in to now handle defense policy, Anthony Tata, wrote a book about that, actually. It's a fiction book, but that makes it even more interesting because a lot of times, if you have things you want to say that are too sensitive, and I've thought about this myself quite a bit, you put them in fiction so that you don't have to be held to account for saying, hey, this is what's really going to happen. I would love to tell you how a civil war would exactly play out, but I can't do it because if I do, it would be too genocidal to be forward here. Let's see. Just tell the IRS we are making great progress in coming up with our tax amount due. We are looking at a skinny tax bill payment to the IRS. Yeah, I mean, we all have to do it together, but the thing is, we don't work well together, Grand Flash, and that's the problem. We have to learn to work together and go ahead and collectively pool ourselves, but we don't because we still keep thinking we're going to put someone over us by this voting system. And I will say, look, you have a right to have a say in who runs you, but voting is a corrupt fraud. It's been for a very long time, and I think you're going to learn that. I think you're going to learn that from Dominion systems, and who knows? If America tries to survive, it may try to survive as an empire, and it may try to do so under Trump, and that may happen, but that doesn't make it good. And as much as today I'm mad at Joe Biden, I probably will be mad at Trump if that comes forward in that because it's still not good. It's still not where we need to be. And if I have friends who are on the left or on the right, I lose friends a lot. Why? Because I say things that I think are true and not because I'm mean to them or I change my opinion, but they're like, I can't believe you believe that. Like I had a libertarian light me up and called me, what did he call me? I want to make sure I say this phrase right. He said I was a demographic grifter. I've never heard that phrase before, but I appreciate it. It was creative. And why? Because I didn't go out there and say, oh, well, I hate people who are like, I don't hate people who aren't like me. They have souls, they have spirits, they're decent folk. I don't necessarily want what they want, and I don't necessarily think we should live on top of each other, but what am I supposed to do? Attack them all or say that, well, you've lived here 200 years and now you got to go? I'm not going to do that either, because if you get along and there's not a problem, I'm not looking to increase conflict. Life is hard enough. Let's not make it more difficult. What I am saying, though, is there's certain ideas that kind of need to be taken out. And the idea is you have to have a common faith. You have to have a shared folk, and that means all of us are going to have to go through something, let's call it the winnowing, where, forget the skinny tax bill. We're going to have to go with skinny identity for a little bit and let go of those things. Let go of your ersatz patriotism for a flag that's bled in too many places where our blood has been sacrificed, not for the benefit of our people, or where we fought wars of, imperial conquest in a lot of ways. And not that we didn't mean well, but let's be honest. All those things that we're throwing out, we're fighting for democracy. No, you're not. No, you're not. Otherwise, you wouldn't be friends with Saudi Arabia and all these other countries. We could talk about they're around the world. It's not about that. It's never been about that. It's been about the idea of control and command, and then that's fine. I mean, if you're honest about it, and look, if you're an imperialist and you're straight up going to say it, that's fine. But understand that all empires fall by the same means they come up, because sooner or later, everyone you make mad is going to come back at you. Whereas instead, you could build something, and that's what we haven't done in a long time. So let's build something new. Let's build something to build back better. What a terrible logo, but I don't agree with that at all, because we don't need to build it back. We need to build it new, and that's where we're at. So, yeah, no, thanks for mentioning that, John. So yeah, I'm asking people, send me, if you can't send me a license plate, if you send me a postcard from where you're at. If you're in the Atlantic, I guarantee you'll get into the center collage. And if you're not in the Atlantic, I'm still going to put it in there. But I'm amassing a wall of license plates for the studio that you guys will like. I actually ordered a Newfoundland license plate because I want the Newfies in, even though I don't know any of them. I've known a couple when I went up to New Brunswick, but the American government has made it nearly impossible for me to travel to Canada anymore, which is really sad. So I can't go up there till things fall apart. Although when they do, I will, and I'll probably. I really need to work on my French some more because I do. I am a Francophile. You all know that, and I think it's useful actually. I think if you understand the French language, you have certain concepts of culture that don't convey in English. Whereas I think English is better at law and contracts, and even in the German language. I talk about my friends in the Midwest; they're very different. And I say as someone who was born in Milwaukee, I understand this a lot better than I pretend. The but it's something where we're going to need an Austrian version more than a Prussian version, I think, and that's a little tricky. But that did work for about 800 years before the Prussians came on the scene and blew up Europe. And I know a lot of people look at that very fondly. But when you have precision minus the idea to bring people together, that's when things get ugly. And I don't think any of us want to really reenact the 20th century. People talk about it, but if you really think about it and know about it, I don't think that's what people want. And it wouldn't be very effective. And oddly enough, it's actually the people who are pushing this who try to reenact it. I always tell people that Herzl and Hitler came out of the same Vienna, but people probably don't want to hear that either. But it is true, in fact, and the fact that they get so mad about it's actually telling. But we'll leave that for another episode, on a different channel that is yet to exist. I mean, you're not allowed to know history if it makes certain groups look good and certain groups look bad. And the truth is, imperialism. When you say your group has to go ahead and destroy other groups to survive, and you have a whole organization that's basically dedicated to going into other countries and breaking things up, whether it's the CIA, whether it's Spetsnaz, whether it's Mossad, any of these ones, that's not good. And Lord knows the Atlantic doesn't want that. We want to be a sort of, Switzerland armed more to the teeth so we can be autarkic and then work along with people on cultural things. I mean, I worked for Ron Paul. I learned a lot from the man, not just about the Federal Reserve, but about the decent way to live. And I think that once upon a time in the Northeast, we understood that between Amish and Mennonites, and even our angry Puritans, so right, we didn't like witches, but that was a community issue. And things should be community issues again. So if you guys have any last minute questions or anything, throw them up here. I'll answer a couple since you listened to my sort of rambling monologue. Hopefully you enjoyed spending your morning with me. I enjoyed spending it with you. And I wanted to just put some ideas out there. I mean, I could cover the news, and sometimes I struggle with what to do with my show because people say, well, you're not focused. And I'm not focused because there's a lot going on. I'm going to talk about my faith because it's important to me. I'm going to talk about science because it's happening around us. I'm going to talk about politics. And I don't think it's helpful for me to draw these lines. I was joking. I was actually telling John, who's in here, I was like, there's room for someone to be a new Art Bell, and I can tell you about things that are suppressed. But ultimately, telling you about all the things around you is less important than helping you understand how to be, a sort of a better person in the sense that you have to reconnect to what's around you. The answers don't come from behind the screen. It comes when this screen shuts off and what you do next. And that's what's really important to each and every one of us, myself very much included. And I've been trying to go a little more low tech lately because I like that. I'm not looking to have faster speed or have to have the bigger life. I just don't think that's the right way forward. I don't think it's going to make you happier because it hasn't done it for 200 years. It's not going to start now. I'll say a quick prayer. You get your last minute questions up. Thank you to everyone who's supporting the program. If you want to send other support, Venmo is always welcome at CVCPRV. Send me your letters, your postcards. I will put them up. Swear about it. Let's see. Dana's probably up and watching this, actually. She's just being quiet and coy because she probably doesn't want to interact. But P.O. Box 35, Greenville Junction, Maine, 04442. And I just want to pray, Heavenly Father, as we sit here 400 years into the founding of New England, of this new thing, that you consecrate the Atlantic land as a land that's seeking your wisdom and your truth, where we will try to love our enemies, not fight our neighbors, and come into conjunction with one another, and learn what lessons you have for us. And I pray that you teach us that wisdom so that we can take our instincts toward a better purpose. And then for those who live without our land, that you find that for all, because we wish for peace for all nations within our country, and that you take power away and you take away the deception from people who are looking in our lands, and that you want to have a greater truth, and that we seek that in the lessons of the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. So in Jesus' name I pray that. Amen. Let's see. You have a question here. Let's see. What do you think the best option is to get rid of big city folk out of the Midwest if there's a separation of states? I live in Nebraska and Omaha doesn't share any of our values. I think that what you would have to do in the medium to long term is you need to reform the education system. I think that going back to maybe generational education, we could have a conversation about this, would actually be worth considering. I don't support mandatory, compulsory public education or having that system. I think it should be divided and localized. I don't think having huge state boards of education or federal education departments is helpful. I don't think having colleges be subsidized is good. I think the whole loan program is a scam. And I don't believe in credentialism. I think if you can do a job, you should be able to do a job more or less. I think that that's the best way to go about it. With respect to what that would do for the longer term, is I think you want to have smaller towns be more viable. I personally support the idea of a tax structure where you would go ahead and tax revenues rather than, or not tax, you would tax, yeah, no, I said that right. You would tax revenues rather than profits so that you don't have things get over a certain size, so that things have to keep local, and that you offer an opportunity for a larger middle with a much smaller bottom by having some smart welfare measures and a much smaller top by having some taxation measures. That's my own thought on it. But I think that for the people, if you live in the rural Midwest, I mean, what you have to do to Omaha is just say, no, we're not going to play along. So if you live in any state like that, or, I'll use an example I know better, New York, if you don't send things in there, we got a trucker strike coming up on the 29th. Maybe that's where it starts. This fits into these sort of things here. And I think, like you say, in the online world, you can have decentralized energy production, you can have decentralized manufacturing, the technological revolution, but don't let capital as it exists take away your ability to have choices in how this operates. They want to centralize. This is ultimately a decentralizing movement. And that's one of the reasons we should encourage people and actually welcome them to leave the cities. But when they leave the cities, they have to leave the city mindset behind and have small towns. I actually think there's nothing lovelier than a good functioning small town. I mean, I don't know the geography of Nebraska well enough to say what that is, but I'd like to believe there are some good ones. I mean, for some reason, I'm conjuring up an image of the old show Jericho as something that could work, or maybe the old Stan movies where they had, what was it? I think was it Pueblo, Colorado? Something like that. But I mean, I think there's certainly opportunities there. And I think that's the best way to go forward. But I think in the short term is that you guys say, we're just not going to play ball with Omaha. I think that's fine. I think that's the way it has to be. And for people there, they're just going to have to learn. And at some point in the not so distant future, I think we'll all be forced to make choices where they say, hey, all of a sudden we're going to have this thing where we're going to say, you're going to have to live like us, or we're going to impose this on you. If your sheriffs don't do it, you're halfway to winning the fight. If they make you posses, even better. On the other hand, if they go the other way, vote them out, recall them, or just don't adhere to them. And look, at the end of the day, and I hate to say this, if law enforcement won't do the job, outnumber them. Get your people together and go ahead and build your own defense. And that's what you have to do. That's what happens when you have empires break up. And I think as we go forward and we see the imposition, especially for Christian folk who worry about the mark, and you all know what I'm saying by that, I think that's how you're going to have to stand against it. Certainly that's the conversation we have up here in Maine, and know that you have friends. And hopefully we can build a network that would exist between different states. It would go through, at least in the Atlantic, we talk about Appalachia. But if you're in the Midwest and through the Great Plains, you guys should be talking to your neighbors over there in Kansas, or in South or Nebraska or the Dakotas. And so you asked about what I think about South Dakota. I think South Dakota is fine. I really don't have a good knowledge of it. I know a lot of people on the right, like Kristi Noem. She seems like someone who's a stand-up person. I don't know how that much about her to say otherwise. And I hope things are well up there. I mean, I think it's good country folk who don't have too many people around and don't go looking for trouble. So I imagine South Dakota is a very nice place as long as you're okay with the land being flatter than not. And I just say that because I don't know. I know the Black Hills are in the west there. I really don't know the geography so well. When I picture the Midwest, my couple experiences going through it involved a lot of corn. Although I did find some pretty places when I was in southern Missouri. And I've driven, like, I think the furthest west I've driven when I lived in Pittsburgh is I drove out to like eastern Iowa, but you just don't really drive that way. And it's a different world. So you guys have to figure out, you're kind of like the Ukraine of the world. So I kind of imagine the Midwest a little bit like Russia does. That you have St. Petersburg and Russia on the coast, and you're sort of an inland Siberia. But I know there are good people there. And if we can help you here from the Atlantic, because we have a sort of different structure that would be helpful, ask, and I will try. I'm going to try to make more time now that there were things that I had to take care of that had to be done before the election. They were done. I'm going to have more time to help and provide leadership. And for those who provide support, that is is one of the things that it allows me to do this more. So I'm going to try to figure a way. I'm probably going to go to Brighteon once I bother to sit and look at it. But right now, honestly, I've been just taking a mental vacation. Actually, I'm going to be reading tonight. I'm going to be reading Timothy Zahn's The Last Command, which, if you like Grand Admiral Thrawn from the original, Star Wars, they call it the Legend series now, but it's really the alternate universe. So much better than where they went with it. Now they make everything, they social justice up everything, of course, but that's Disney. Disney's awful. And by the way, speaking of awful, did you see Fox News hired a crisis management team because everyone got sick of seeing how bad they were? And don't believe Newsmax either, by the way. If you want real news that are outside this, go listen to True News. Give Rick Wiles a listen. You'll like that. He does a much better job than any of these fools. And it's maybe not be the same level of depth in some ways, but he gives good scriptural right-wing take on things that I think is sympathetic to a more Christian. I mean, he's Christian before he's a conservative, and I think that's important. But anyway, so that's my thought on the Midwest. I don't know it as well as maybe I should. Who knows? I mean, when we draw some maps, we always imagine doing things. But I mean, what's interesting is the difference between, I will say, between the Midwest and the Northeast. That's going to be the most difficult is our ideas on environmentalism in a lot of ways. Up here, we take our environment very seriously because we live in trees and certain delicate ecosystems, whereas things tend to be more monocultures down there. And I know that is something that's a little tricky. Yeah, a lot of people like Howie Ka say it, how they sit up here in New England. So over there in Baston. But it's and I think for what it's worth, the environmentalists do eventually have the right of it, but not in the sense that they want to have this climate change crap is kind of BS, but the idea that you just need to be good stewards of your land. You don't want to do what Germany did, which is clear cut the forest that used to be there. I don't think that's the answer. But in the Midwest, it's a little different, and I get that. And that might be one of those things that needs to be talked about, and that would have to be kind of localized. And it might be one of the reasons why the Northeast. I mean, I've accepted that the lines may be as simple. I mean, if at the end of the day, if we were up here in New England, kind of went with the Atlantic Canada, that's good enough for us. And I'd like to get. I think it makes a lot of sense for us to get into the Mid-Atlantic eventually, because I think it's going to be our reclamation project, and it's something we're going to have to fix. And there's something to that. I mean, it's lordly work to go ahead and fix things that are a problem. And no one, we have people who are experts who come from universities who have a lot of names after their thing, who don't have a lot of ideas, but are given support because of their credentials. Whereas instead of that, maybe we need people who have really good ideas coming down and speaking to it. And maybe that requires a degree of bravery that I haven't had to this point. Because I'll be honest with you, I have struggled for years to figure out how to economically survive. Because if I say the wrong thing, I get shut off of Amazon, and I ultimately have to go flip burgers. And that's what they do. It's a form of economic blackmail, and I don't like that. So hopefully I've done the work to kind of build a support base that you guys will support the work, and I'll figure out a way to do that, to monetize it enough. Not because I want to be rich. I mean, I'm willing to live on $1,000 a month, which is like nothing. But, it may get hard one day, especially if they say, well, you have to have digital currencies unless you take this vaccine, because I'm not doing that, or unless you agree to these lockdowns, because I'm not doing that either. I mean, who knows? Maybe we'll have to play the Robin Hood role. And I think about that a lot, actually. I think about this question. I'm sure you guys think of it too, right? That are we better off having a fight now that's not on quite the right terms before a bigger, worse enemy comes? If you knew you could pull the plug on Skynet before they shut it on, how much would you be willing to contemplate? Subscription is probably an option here, but I don't want to do it here because, frankly, one, YouTube takes 30% off the top, which is absolutely ridiculous for what they provide. And two, the minute I reach certain critical mass, they would shut it down. Because they do. They've shut down so many shows and so many channels. And the only reason I survive is because I'm under the radar. I will set up another service. I don't know what it is, but I don't really like what's out there. Thank you for that, by the way. I saw that text; it popped up above, and I do try to put the things out there that are, I think, useful and helpful to people. I hope that makes for a good program. And I didn't plan on doing a long show this morning, but I had a lot to say, and sometimes it happens that way. So I will try to figure that out. But I need your help. I mean, honestly, and I need your participation, your support, and we'll get some flags out there. I got like 80 more of them in the basement, so I could bring some of them up. And I know I owe James out in Texas one, and we'll get some of the fines and lines out there, and we'll get people talking. And I'm willing to accept and take it as a token of faith that I will find a way to survive, even if they take away every financial means from me, because they're going to do it to all of us anyway. It says in the Bible that if the Lord can provide for the birds and for the animals, why can't he? Will you think he would provide any less from you? And we've learned this. Dana and I have fallen upwards so many times and crashed to better situations that there's something to be said for when you do the Lord's work. And I try to. I'm not a perfect servant. I'm a very problematic guy, and I get angry and I have emotions, and I say things that maybe I should say better. And I'm trying to grow in wisdom. I mean, I did turn 40 this week, so I've got the gray and the beard. And I tell you what, people always say, "Oh, you get rid of the beard." If I get rid of my beard, I lose about 15 years, and people who are over my age don't listen. And if you think any Maine farmers who are used to going around in muck boots would listen to anything about me, you don't know the first thing about living up here, and that's fine. Why would you? But I'm not trying to play to the expectations of what I should be. I'm trying to find the actual solutions, and that's a hard thing. And I'm going to say things that are going to make people mad, and I just ask that you give me a little bit of grace when I do that. So. But I will help where I can help, and if we could put something together, I mean, who knows? We could get into the Midwest, we could get into the South. I don't know, but even if we go separate, but we have a core understanding, and we can do so peacefully, that's a win too. But I'm absolutely determined, for whatever reason, to collect the upper Northeast, because I love it up here. This is my home, and I just feel bad that I can't go. I actually would love to get in the car today and go drive up to those red sands on Prince Edward Island. I just love it up there for whatever reason. It's boring. I mean, it literally is boring, but I love that. I mean, maybe it's because there's too much going in my head and I like the quiet. But I don't think we're going to have that for a while, to be honest, ladies and gentlemen. I think that we're going to have a war, and I don't know if it's going to be international or if it's going to be national. I think that what we're going to see is that if we do not agree silently to go along with the impositions of lockdowns and vaccines, that we are going to be forced into fights and reservations. And I don't think we should take it passively. I just don't. And I realize that I'm tipping my hat a little bit, but that's okay. I'm willing to do that and say that I'm not going to accept that. And I'm going to talk to people, and people are going to listen to me because I can speak well. And hopefully some of the ideas I have make sense. And I will talk to my friends throughout the Atlantic, and I'll talk to my friends out west, and I'll talk to my friends in the South, and I'll talk to anyone who listens. And I'll butcher French if they'll get the Quebecois to listen. I'll even try a little bit of Spanish, even though I don't even like speaking that language. No me gusta español, ningún. My Spanish is real rusty at this point. But in any case, because we all are fighting the same global machine, and this is a bigger fight. I said people had 20,000 people read The Coming Civil War, but in the last chapter, I said I had a hunch that in a decade we would be talking about the fight against AI, against a global system being put in. And I will say, I genuinely believe during these lockdowns, we're seeing the imposition of the infrastructure for the technology. And I'll tell you how I know it, because the cell phone service improving a lot in rural Maine. So people are putting things in they're not talking about. And I hear from people where things are. And is there a conspiracy because there's infrastructure? No, there's not. But when you look at the Great Recess, when you look at what's his name, Klaus Schwab, and all these ideas, why is there always the terrible ideas either come from the Germans or, well, the people they always fight against? It's one of the reasons why I actually look at the Midwest and be like, maybe us English and French should just keep apart. Who knows? But, Slavs to the rescue, right? I don't know. I don't like it. I don't trust it. And, I tell you, I do read prophetic words. I mean, you can agree with them. You could disagree with them. I will tell you one thing that I do read a lot of. A lot of people are predicting that Trump is somehow going to pull this out and that he's going to get killed for it. And if that happens, the fight is on. And if the fight is on, just remember, who are you fighting for and why are you fighting? Because you don't want to just be led to a fight. How many wars by proxy do we have to support before we realize that you're fighting the real bad guy? I'll leave you with a great line. For those of you who haven't read the book, Ender's Game, or if you've seen the movie, it's actually a decent movie adaptation. I think it was kind of underrated, oddly enough. At the end of it, you have the Ben Kingsley character, Mazer Rackham, saying to Ender, the little boy who's being tricked into fighting a war of genocide, he's be like, after you win this battle, then you'll be ready to fight the real enemy. And we haven't been willing to fight the real enemy, because the real enemy, just like when we saw in Star Wars, right? Luke Skywalker cuts off Darth Vader's head, and what's he see? He sees his own face. We're fighting each other. Why aren't we fighting the right people? We'll talk a lot more about that going forward, and that those people who declare their allegiance to the other side, that's who you need to fight. You can't save everybody, but you need to understand the difference between those who are misled and those who are misleading. Don't be a Pied Piper. Be a happy sheep, follow a good shepherd, let some sheepdogs protect you. We could use a couple of them around here. God bless each and every one of you throughout the Atlantic, throughout the Southron Nation, throughout the West. I'm going to refer to you as your different nations because I think if I draw the maps well enough, people will listen to me because they do that. I've always been sort of ahead of the idea. I always say I'm sort of like the pebble that causes the avalanche. That's what I like to be. And I'm better at shooting at that level because if I get too granular, all we do is fight over details, and I don't want to do that. That's not helpful. It's helpful for me to plant ideas. I'm at that level, and I've accepted that. It's not necessarily my job to be out there wearing a suit doing the day-to-day grunt work. It doesn't make me happy, and it doesn't lead to good outcomes for anyone. Anyway, I'll keep doing what I do. You guys keep doing what you do. I will be back. What is it today? We're Thursday? Thursday? Wednesday? What day is it? Do we even know? Wednesday? No, Thursday. I will be back. I will have my Friday show at 7 p.m. I'm going to be hosting some guests, but we are going to do it earlier in the evening so that we have an opportunity to continue. Bring forward your questions. We will talk much more about news that's ongoing. I suspect we'll learn a lot more about vote fraud. We'll talk much more about the Atlantic Nation going forward. I'm going to talk about reconciliations between faith, between finance, and between how government works and all those things, and let you see that those divisions are kind of BS. And then learn how to talk to one another. Maybe we'll do some basic stuff. And I'll invite some people in. And for those of you who sit here from the SPLC, ADL, and all these other groups, why don't you pipe up a little bit? Why don't you do something useful instead of causing problems? You know, is your salary worth so much to you? Take your 30 pieces of silver, shine them up real nice, turn them sideways, and stick them straight up your candy. Well, you know what The Rock says. God bless each and every one of you. Have a good rest of your morning, and I will see you, I guess, tomorrow. All right. Bye-bye.